It could be positive influence or a negative influence, but there's no way out. If you plan on living a life in contact with other people, which I assume most of you do, you can't choose not to influence other people. So everyone, especially those in CGI, need to start thinking about what kind of influence they want to exert. In other words, what kinds of leaders do you all want to be? So tonight, I want to do my part in the process of getting you to think about an effective leadership style. And I can't think of a better way to do that than to share a story about the best leader I've ever seen. So a few years ago, I used to work at the White House. Don't worry, that's not the best leader I ever saw. I was a correspondent for CBS News, covering the last few years of the George W. Bush administration. Now, when people would find out that I used to actually go to work at the White House and sit in the front row at press conferences, enjoying a literal front row seat, watching the most powerful man in the world do his job, people would always ask me what the experience taught me about leadership. And whenever they asked a question, I'd always laugh to myself, as if Washington was the place I'd learned anything about leadership. Because what I know about leadership, I learned in Iraq. 3 years before I got the job of covering the president, I'd been embedded with the 3rd Infantry Division of the U.S. Army during the invasion of Iraq. Now, the first day in the desert, I was walking to a latrine, which is what the military calls toilets. And I heard this voice, "Yo." I stopped, and I was looking at the biggest, bravest man I'd ever seen in my life. 6'3", 230 pounds, chiseled, African-American, black wraparound sunglasses, and he flipped me a roll of toilet paper. Not going to find any in there. On my way back out, I stopped by to say thank you. And I walked over with my hand extended. And he put out his fist to bump knuckles. Not any water in there either. That was my introduction to Major Morris Goines. Mo had a phrase for his top soldiers: tough as woodpecker's lips. And that described nobody more accurately than it described Mo. Mo was the S3 for the 1st Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division, the operations officer. That means he couldn't walk 10 feet across camp without somebody stopping him to ask him a question about something. Could have been anything, from where the powdered eggs were to where the body bags were. And it could be anything in between. On one of those walks across camp, after he'd been stopped 5 times in 50 yards, I asked him if it ever got to him. The relentless pressure, did it ever make him buckle? And he just stared straight ahead as we walked. Right into the eyes of the next soldier coming with a request. Comes with the parking space, bro. Comes with the parking space. He had a lot of things to worry about, moving 5,000 soldiers toward Baghdad. But he always managed to keep an eye out on me. I think he sized me up pretty quickly as a guy who had absolutely no earthly idea what the hell he was doing in a war zone. A few hours after the toilet paper incident, a sandstorm swept in over the desert. A shamal, it was called. I was standing outside the command tent writing my story when all of a sudden the storm kicked up. It was so fast. It was like a hurricane with sand. In a matter of a couple of seconds, I couldn't see my hand stretched out right in front of my face. I was totally disoriented, having no idea how to get back to the command tent 20 yards away from me. I was starting to panic. knowing that I could easily wander away from the safety and into the desert, which wouldn't be a very good idea in the middle of a schmall. All of a sudden, as my anxiety started to spike, I felt this meat-hook arm grab me right around my back, a giant hand cupping my ribs and pulling me into safety. It was Mo. And inside the tent, he threw his head back, cackling with laughter. Welcome to the desert. For the next 10 days, as we pushed into Iraq, Mo never stopped. It was the single largest movement of troops, the greatest distance in the shortest amount of time in military history. From drawing up battle plans, hopping into the middle of a massive traffic jam and untangling it, to supervising the shipping home of the bodies of the first 2 soldiers from the 1st Brigade killed in action, he never stopped. 2, maybe 3 hours of sleep a night, sandstorms, chemical weapons scares, 110-degree heat, he never stopped. Now, you lose track of the days when you're in the desert in the best of circumstances. They really do all run together. But the desert grows all the more disorienting during a war, because that compounds the fog. Even so, even during a war, Sunday mornings in the desert have their own unique feel, their own rhythm. Guys standing around in circles shooting the breeze, a little bit of a break, a chance for people to gather themselves. Now on this Sunday morning, we were standing in a circle, about a dozen of us, right around this time 9 years ago. Sweet 16 weekend in the NCAA tournament. I was the only guy with a satellite phone. So I kept calling the CBS news desk in New York, and I would get the scores and relay them to the soldiers. Most popular guy in camp, as long as the phone was working. Amidst the chatting and the joke cracking, I could feel the first bit of normalcy in the 10 days since the war had started. Just wanting to extend that feeling, normalcy, for as long as I could, I turned to Mo, just to keep the chit-chat going. And I asked him how he decided to join the Army. And he started to tell me about his Uncle Alan, who had been a paratrooper in Vietnam. And he was describing his boyhood memory of Unc coming home. And all of a sudden, he threw his head back laughing. That same high-pitched cackle I'd heard in the sandstorm. And once again, he threw his arm behind me, cut my ribs, and broke me away from the circle. Trotted us out into the desert, about 50 yards away from the group, just the 2 of us. And I looked up at him. And I realized Mo Goines wasn't laughing at all. This guy, bravest man I've ever met in my life, tough as woodpecker's lips, was crying. Tears were running down from behind his wraparound sunglasses. And we stood out in the desert for about 20 minutes. And we chatted a bit more about Uncle Alan. I talked about my dad. We talked about North Carolina, where I'd worked and he'd grown up. Talked about college basketball. And we stood in silence, just letting it all go. And then all of a sudden, he just clapped his hands together. All right, church over, let's go back. And back to the circle we went. And I realized then that I just had a crystallizing moment in my understanding of leadership. Mo Goines knew that he needed a release, but the last thing he would ever allow was for the men and women who he commanded to see him bend, never mind buckle. So out to the desert we went. But that wasn't the secret of his leadership. The secret was this. I suspect that if you gave some truth serum to the soldiers under his command, every single one of them would tell you they knew how much he cared. This is point number 1 in tonight's story about leadership, guys. You want to be a good leader? At the end of the day, what matters most is how successful you are at communicating to the people who you are leading that you care. Mo Goines was the kind of leader who cared so much about the men and women he was commanding that he would cry in the desert for them. And they knew it. And that was the secret of his effectiveness. About a week after Mo and I had that little conversation in the desert, the 1st Brigade stood poised at the bottom of a bridge that spanned the Euphrates River. The military put all the news crews up front. They told us it was to get good pictures. I wondered if there wasn't some other reason, such as making really good targets for the first shots from the Iraqis. Now, my team was composed of a cameraman named Mario Di Carvalho. He'd been with the Portuguese Special Forces and fought the Cubans in the jungles of Angola before spending the next 30 years as a combat photographer for CBS News. There was a Brit named Jeff Thorpe Willett, who was running our satellite dish, and he'd been with the British Navy for a number of years, working for a number of different TV outlets afterwards in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Rwanda, Yemen, and Gaza. Then there was me. I was the guy who needed diapers in the back seat, screaming for his mommy. A specialist walked over to the window to speak with Mario. Mario was driving our Humvee. Now, up to this point, we had encountered very little resistance from the Iraqis. It really had been like a knife through butter. Whatever ended up happening in Iraq, the first couple weeks of the war was a straight, unmolested, untroubled shot for the U.S. Army. But we knew that was about to change. The Iraqis were well aware that once the American troops got over the Euphrates, the gig was up. So they had massed whatever they had by way of troops and artillery on the other side. We looked across the river, and it looked like something out of Apocalypse Now. Apache helicopters swaying in and out of the palm trees, thick plumes of black smoke rising from where they'd taken out some Iraqi units. But we could hear plenty of explosions, mortar, rocket-powered grenades, that indicated the Iraqis were fighting back from their fortified positions.